Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. The outlaw Tom Blackjack Ketchum moments before his public execution in Clayton, New Mexico in 1901. Known for train and bank robberies, he became a symbol of the end of the era of great outlaws. The hanging attempt, carried out improperly with an excessively long rope, ended in a brutal manner and shocked the population, forever marking the history of punishment in the West. Louis-Nicolas Flaubert was responsible for one of the greatest revolutions in the history of firearms. In 1845, he created the single-piece metallic cartridge, combining projectile, gunpowder, and primer into one unit. This invention replaced separate and dangerous systems, making firing more reliable, faster, and safer. The concept of the bullet used today derives directly from this innovation. Here we see prospector Archie Smith seated on the porch of his cabin in Eagle Creek near Murray, Idaho in 1889. Prospectors like him lived in simple wooden structures built near rivers to facilitate work. Extraction required daily manual labor and few tools. Murray once had thousands of inhabitants before entering rapid economic decline. Edward W. Johnson appears on the left still intact, unaware that he would lose his right arm shortly after this photograph in 1888 during a shootout. In the center is Texas Ranger Lorenzo K. Creekman, known for his firm actions in Texas. On the right stands Sheriff A.L. E. Hutchinson of Parker County. The trio represents different law enforcement forces in an era marked by constant violence and confrontations that turned officers into legendary figures almost overnight. A firing squad of armed men forms the execution line of a condemned man in a rural area of Mexico in the 1910s. Executions of this type were common during the instability surrounding the Mexican Revolution, when local authorities, military forces, and paramilitary groups carried out punishments against those accused of banditry. Often, these trials served more to impose control and fear than to ensure justice. Shortly after the Wounded Knee Massacre in January of 1891, Buffalo Bill Cody appears mounted beside General Nelson A. Miles, joining the forces that arrived in the region after the final repression of the Lakota. Cody, a former buffalo hunter and then a showman, acted as a scout and interpreter for the Army. Wyatt Earp's Northern Saloon in Tonopah, Nevada, operated around 1902 amid the height of the silver rush, attracting miners, gamblers, and adventurers from across the West. Although it bore his name, the bar was managed by Alan Martin, while Earp divided his time between mining investments and betting on new veins in the region. Chief Joseph led his people for months in retreat, attempting to reach Canada to escape the army. Surrounded, exhausted, with women and children suffering from cold and hunger, he surrendered on October 5, 1877, in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana. At that moment, he declared, "I will fight no more forever." The phrase sealed the end of the Nez Perce War and became one of the most symbolic speeches in Indigenous history in the United States. George Armstrong Custer appears surrounded by Indigenous scouts in a military camp. Kneeling on the left is Bloody Knife, an Arikara scout and close ally known for his skill in tracking and combat. These scouts were essential to the Army during the Indian Wars, guiding troops through hostile territories. Months later, Custer would die at Little Bighorn, while Bloody Knife would also lose his life in combat. Annie Oakley was already a living legend when she performed this demonstration in 1922 at 62 years of age. Known for her extraordinary accuracy, she built her fame in the 19th century, performing at fairs, circuses, and in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Even decades after her peak, she continued to demonstrate skill, discipline, and control with firearms, challenging the standards of her time. In 1903, this group of simple cabins on the outskirts of Phoenix housed the so-called lungers, people suffering from tuberculosis who migrated to Arizona in search of the dry climate. It was believed that desert air could relieve coughing, fever, and slow the progression of the disease. Many patients arrived without resources and lived in isolation, supported by charity, improvised sanatoriums, or small camps. A Texas cowboy poses around 1870 wearing typical frontier elements: worn boots with spurs, a revolver at his waist, and a knife attached to his belt. The tobacco pouch, ornamented with beads from Southern Plains indigenous groups such as the Kiowa or Comanche, reveals the constant contact between cultures in the West. Armed men pose after a real confrontation, still holding the rifles and shotguns used in the capture of Ned Christie. The photograph was taken on November 1, 1892, shortly after the action that ended a 5-year manhunt. Christie, a Cherokee leader, was accused of murdering a federal marshal, a crime he always denied. Sheltered in a log fortification in Indian Territory, he resisted successive arrest attempts until he was surrounded by dozens of armed men and killed after an intense exchange of gunfire. The Gem Theater was one of the most influential bars in Deadwood around 1880, operating as a center for gambling, drinking, and illicit business. The establishment belonged to Al Swearingen, a feared pimp and businessman who controlled much of the city. In the image, Swearingen appears on the right, near the counter. Observing the hall, he ruled with a firm hand and without interference from the law. These are Indigenous warriors who took part in the Battle of Little Bighorn, fought in 1876 in what is now the state of Montana. The meeting took place in 1948 and marked the last reunion of surviving Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho from that conflict. The battle became known for the defeat of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, commanded by George Custer, becoming a central episode of the Indian Wars. A group of men and a boy pose proudly in front of a large block of gold amalgam, a mixture of gold and mercury that weighed about 500 pounds. The sign indicates a connection with the Cottonwood Placer Company in the region of present-day Nucala, Montrose County, Colorado. Some hold Winchester Model 1873 rifles, common in mining areas, while the boy appears handling a double-barrel shotgun. This group of men took part in the capture of Sheriff Henry Newton Brown of Caldwell, Kansas, accused of involvement in the Medicine Valley Bank robbery. In regions where the law was weak or distant, these improvised militias emerged quickly, driven by fear, revenge, or the desire for control. This type of collective action was seen by many as a legitimate way to maintain order. Thathlo Harjo lived through more than a century marked by conflicts and forced displacement. Born in 1791, he fought in 2 Seminole Wars, was removed to Indian Territory in 1842, and returned to combat by joining the 1st Regiment in 1861. After the end of the war, he settled in what is now Seminole County, Oklahoma, where he lived until 1904, reaching the age of 113 years. Jenny Balder's brothel operated in Jerome, Arizona in 1898, when the city was experiencing the height of copper mining. Such establishments were profitable businesses and, in many cases, tolerated by local authorities because they attracted workers, money, and activity. The women lived in the same building and followed strict rules imposed by the owner. 2 men sit on a staircase displaying sacks of golden dust, the result of about 15 days of extraction at Gold Run Creek in the Yukon around 1898. During the gold rush, quantities like this could mean immediate fortune or only temporary means to continue digging. Gold was weighed, stored in sealed bags, and used directly as currency, paying for food, equipment, and passage in a territory where official money was often secondary. A Crow man from the Absaroki tribe rides across a snow-covered field wearing heavy furs to endure the harsh winter. The photograph, taken in 1908 in the Pryor Mountains of Montana, shows how the horse was vital for transportation, hunting, and surveillance. Even under extreme cold, These scouts traveled long distances, guiding groups and observing enemy movements. Prospectors spend entire days bound to the pan and sluices, repeating exhausting movements in the hope of finding gold. Most would never become rich. Gold appeared as fine dust, requiring nearly infinite patience. Many abandoned everything after months without results, while others remained, living in shacks, facing cold and disease, sustained only by the promise of a discovery capable of changing their lives. 3 men pose elegantly in front of the camera, each holding an 1849 Colt pocket revolver. With a small and easily concealed design, the Colt pocket was especially valued for its discreet size, ideal for those who needed a personal defense weapon. Although originally designed for military use, the model became widely used by civilians, merchants, and even gunfighters. In 1886, Lieutenant Charles B. Gatewood entered an Apache camp in the Sierra Madre Mountains south of the Mexican border, accompanied only by 2 Apache scouts. The mission was extremely risky, but Gatewood trusted the respect he had built over the years. It was during this meeting that he succeeded in convincing Geronimo to surrender to General Nelson A. Miles, ending one of the last Apache resistances. 5 miners pose in front of a rustic cabin in the mountains of Colorado. Built with rough logs and an earth-covered roof, the shelter served as protection against intense cold and isolation. These men spent months far from towns, living from exhausting labor in gold and silver mines, relying on group cooperation to survive in a harsh environment where comfort was almost non-existent. The Jackson Bar marked the landscape of Idaho as a simple establishment built from rough wood, typical of newly formed settlements. Frequented by armed men, the location reveals how normal the presence of rifles and revolvers was in daily life. These bars emerged along mining and trade routes, serving a transient population accustomed to insecurity and the constant need for personal defense. Despite being marginalized, many prostitutes were tolerated and even protected by local society because they stimulated the economy and paid taxes. They were excluded from churches and respectable events, but during crises they received important clients such as politicians, judges, and businessmen. They suffered strong moral stigma, violence, and discrimination, yet some gained space and influence in society. In 1895, Las Vegas was an isolated agricultural village in the desert, very distant from the modern image it would gain decades later. Life revolved around water, the railroad, and small rural properties. It served as a strategic point for travelers and workers with a simple economy based on livestock, local trade, and supply without any luxury or entertainment. Chung On appears in front of his Chinese goods store in Virginia City, Montana, in 1896, when local mining was entering decline. The business supplied food, utensils, and imported products to miners and residents. Chinese immigrants maintained active businesses in the West despite discriminatory laws and social exclusion at the end of the 19th century. William Bloody Bill Anderson appears here shortly before his violent end, a feared figure of Confederate guerrilla warfare in Missouri. Known for brutal attacks, summary executions, and reprisals against civilians, he led men outside the regular army, exploiting the chaos of the Civil War. On October 26, 1864, he was surprised by Union troops in an ambush near Albany and shot to death. Here, loggers stage a confrontation around a card table. Despite the staged scene, real fights were common in camps. Exhausting workdays, alcohol, gambling, and disputes over pay frequently ended in fists, knives, or gunfire. In isolated places such as Lyonsville, without a constant law presence, conflicts were resolved on the spot, and a man's reputation often depended on how he asserted himself. two flathead indigenous men of the Salish people appear mounted on horseback in Montana in 1899, in front of a traditional lodge and a wooden house built by settlers. The photograph records daily life in the Old West, when native communities still used the horse as their main means of transportation while being surrounded by European settlements, missionary schools, and military posts. Frank L. Schmid appears mounted and armed, representing the typical profile of men who joined Texas law enforcement forces at the end of the 19th century. He joined the Texas Rangers in 1886, serving in Company D during a period marked by constant armed conflicts. In August 1889, he was shot in the line of duty, survived but never recovered his health, dying in 1893 due to complications from his injuries. Wagons loaded with bales occupy the street as merchants, farmers, and buyers spread along the main road. In 1909, Childress was experiencing the peak of cotton production, the foundation of the local economy, and the engine of urban growth in northern Texas. The harvest attracted producers from distant rural areas, moved warehouses, banks, and railroads, and turned sale days into true events. Steamboat, the famous bucking horse of Wyoming rodeos, never allowed a rider to stay mounted, earning a reputation that spread across the region in the early 20th century. His defiant behavior became legendary at riding competitions that drew large rural crowds. Steamboat's image later inspired Wyoming's official state emblem, adopted in 1917, closely associated with ranching and rodeo traditions. Cowboys pause from work to eat lunch amid long cattle drives and constant travel. Moments like this were rare but essential to regain strength after days on horseback, sleeping outdoors, and enduring extreme weather. Meals usually included cooked beans, salted or dried meat, hard bread, strong coffee, and, when possible, bacon or fresh meat prepared on the spot. Treasure City emerged in Nevada in 1869, driven by a sudden silver rush, growing within months from an improvised camp into a busy town with hotels, saloons, gambling houses, and its own newspapers. Like many boomtowns, it experienced an intense but brief peak. When the veins were exhausted, the population left almost as quickly as it had arrived. In March of 1886, frontier photographer Camillus Sidney Fly accompanied a military expedition authorized by General George Crook into Sonora, Mexico. During the campaign against the Apaches led by Geronimo, Fly recorded extremely rare moments of the conflict, producing the only known photographs of Native Americans during active warfare. The photograph of a carriage in front of the Beaumont Hotel captures a period of intense activity in Ouray in the late 19th century. Founded in 1886, the hotel became one of the city's most important buildings, frequented by mine owners, investors, and travelers drawn by the gold and silver rushes in Colorado. At the time, it symbolized prosperity, constant movement, and the attempt to impose sophistication amid the harsh life of the West. Josie Washburn stood out in the Old West as one of the most influential brothel managers in Nebraska. More than physical beauty, it was her ability to negotiate, enforce rules, and protect the women under her responsibility that ensured her success. She invested in hygiene, security, and organization, gained local respect, and even cooperated with authorities, something rare in a marginalized profession. James Brown Miller, nicknamed Killin' Jim, built an ambiguous reputation in the Old West by moving easily between law and crime. He served as sheriff, deputy, and guard when it brought prestige or protection, but also worked as a hired gun, responsible for carefully planned ambushes. He preferred long-distance attacks from hidden positions, reinforcing a reputation as a coward to some and a strategist to others. He was lynched in 1909, ending a career marked by murder contracts and opportunistic alliances. The Taft Bar was part of the harsh routine of a town marked by frequent violence, improvised justice, and constant circulation of armed outsiders. Arguments often ended in fights, debts were collected on the spot, and information about jobs, escapes, or crimes circulated freely. Establishments like this helped shape the region's dangerous reputation, where the law rarely arrived first. John Woodard Wood Saunders and J. Walter Durbin appear as representatives of a generation of Texas Rangers who operated with few resources and great autonomy. In the final decades of the 19th century, these men patrolled isolated areas, confronted cattle thieves, fugitives, and border conflicts. Their work combined investigation, armed confrontation, and long journeys on horseback. In May of 1889, Guthrie erupted in tension when residents surrounded the newly built jail in Oklahoma Territory. The city had emerged almost overnight after the land run, bringing disputes over land, positions, and authority. Without solid institutions, armed crowds took control, pressuring judges and sheriffs. Here we see two Cheyenne men in Montana around 1900 prepared for the sun dance, one of the most central rituals of their culture. The ceremony marked moments of spiritual renewal, strengthening community bonds and collective decision-making. Held during the summer, it could last several days and involve long periods of singing, fasting, and dancing. The Pear Street grocery store in Beaumont, Jefferson County belonged to Melton Bowie and operated as one of the city's most important commercial points. Bowie was one of the first African-American businessmen in Beaumont, working during a period marked by strong racial restrictions in the southern United States. In addition to commerce, records indicate he was recognized as a skilled carpenter. Creede, Colorado appears here at the height of its short and intense fame in the early 1890s, when the Silver Rush transformed the small village into a gathering point for dangerous and influential figures. Soapy Smith, a professional con man, Bob Ford, the killer of Jesse James, and Bat Masterson, lawman and gambler, walked the same streets amid saloons, gambling, and violence. A group of cowboys pose armed, holding rifles that were direct extensions of their work. Many used repeating firearms such as Winchesters, valued for rapid firing and the ability to reload without disassembly. Revolvers were usually kept holstered for close range, while rifles served for hunting, defense, and longer-distance confrontations. Men play Pharaoh at the White Elephant Saloon in Bingham, Utah, around 1906. Pharaoh was one of the most popular gambling games of the era, common in saloons frequented by miners, cowboys, and adventurers. These establishments functioned as social centers, mixing drinking, betting, and negotiations, and often attracted conflicts, fraud, and armed confrontations. A couple pauses midway through their journey west. Before roads and comfort, travel meant months facing unpredictable weather, disease, isolation, and lack of supplies. Many were driven by cheap land, work opportunities, or simple hope for a fresh start. Each stop could bring rest or danger, as accidents, attacks, and loss were part of the path to a new life. Far from armed conflict, Wyatt Earp appears along the banks of the Colorado River near Arizona. The scene belongs to the 1920s, when he lived away from the role of sheriff and the violence of the Old West. Earp became famous decades earlier in Tombstone after the 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral, an episode that shaped frontier history. Indigenous families camp at South Pass at the base of the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming around 1870. The tipis indicate temporary occupation linked to hunting routes, trade, and seasonal movement. The region was a strategic crossing point in the West, used by explorers, migrants, and native peoples trying to maintain their way of life amid expansion. Haircuts were part of the practical routine of cowboys at the Matador Ranch in 1908, done in an improvised manner with simple scissors and without mirrors. Like this basic care, Many other personal tasks were handled at camp, such as sewing torn clothes, repairing boots, treating wounds, and even improvising baths with water heated over a fire. Bat Masterson, at 23 years of age, and Wyatt Earp, at 28, pose in Ford County, Kansas, around 1876, during the expansion of frontier towns. Both worked as lawmen and professional gamblers in regions marked by frequent violence. Earp would become famous for armed confrontations, while Masterson later pursued a career as a journalist. Farmers pose in front of their newly acquired land when owning property meant independence and status. These families lived from basic farming and livestock raising, facing isolation, intense manual labor, and limited resources. The simple house represented years of continuous effort, strict economy, and hope for stability. Deadwood emerged as a chaotic settlement driven by the gold rush in the Black Hills, attracting miners, adventurers, merchants, and criminals. Without formal law in its early years, the town grew rapidly with saloons, brothels, and gambling. Armed conflicts were common, as were legendary figures of the era. With fewer than 150 inhabitants in 1890, Mesquite was still a small commercial hub, but already played a strategic role in northern Texas. The district gathered warehouses, blacksmith shops, and supply points, serving farmers and travelers. The arrival of the railroad in the following years transformed the area, accelerating commerce, attracting new residents, and integrating the region into Dallas' economic roots. Harry Yunt appears alone atop the Rocky Mountains, armed and attentive to the surrounding wilderness. He was the first forest ranger of Yellowstone National Park in the 1870s, when environmental laws barely existed. He patrolled vast areas without support, confronted poachers, dealt with fires, and enforced rules in isolated regions, helping establish the foundations of the modern national park system. Touch the Clouds was a respected Lakota chief of the Miniconjou subtribe, living during a period of intense tension on the northern plains. In 1877, when this photograph was taken in Nebraska, his people faced constant pressure from United States expansion, broken treaties, and forced loss of traditional lands. A firm leader, he symbolized Lakota cultural and political resistance amid the disintegration of indigenous life. Calamity Jane appears alongside friends in Gilt Edge, Montana in 1897, already known for her unconventional life. Martha Jane Canary gained fame as a scout, messenger, and constant figure in mining camps, bars, and improvised towns. She dressed like a man, drank in public, and moved among soldiers and adventurers, becoming a symbol of the untamed West. The Whiskey the Road to Ruin bar operated as one of the main meeting points in Gila Bend, Arizona in 1880. Frequented by cowboys, travelers, and gamblers, the establishment was known for abundant alcohol, constant betting, and conflicts that often ended in fights. In transit towns like Gila Bend, such bars served not only for leisure, but as centers of business, alliances, and frontier tensions. Roy Bean's Saloon in Langtree functioned as a bar, improvised court, and local center of power. In this 1918 photograph, Texas Ranger C. Bell poses there with two other rangers responsible for enforcing the law in the region. Suspects captured by them were taken to the bar, where Bean held quick trials based on his own sense of justice, arbitrary fines, and complete disregard for legal formalities. Men gather in a tavern in Southern California around 1890. These saloons functioned as social centers, places for gambling, information exchange, and work agreements, where farmers, gunmen, travelers, and merchants met daily, often resolving disputes far from formal law. In this 1887 photograph, we see the old Union Station in Austin, serving as a vital point in the Texas Railroad network, connecting passengers, freight, and commerce to the International and Great Northern Railroad. The station boosted urban growth, facilitated the flow of goods, and transformed Austin into a strategic link between regional routes and the rest of the country. Tombstone's main street appears almost empty, lined with wooden facades housing saloons, hotels, and commercial buildings. In the 1880s, this stretch concentrated the movement of the mining town, marked by quick wealth, gambling, alcohol, and violence. It was in this setting that figures such as Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday circulated daily, while armed conflicts and power disputes were part of routine life. The Combination Saloon emerged in Utah like many frontier bars, improvised, nearly empty, and built hastily to serve a newly founded town. These saloons often opened before permanent homes existed, using raw boards, simple counters, and few chairs. Men, women, and children pose in front of a mine set into a hillside in Cripple Creek, Colorado in 1893. Families lived close to their work, surrounded by tents, improvised tracks, and pack animals. While some sought fortune during the gold rush, most faced exhausting labor, constant risks, and a life marked by instability and hardship. The Tombstone Baseball Club emerged in the 1880s as one of the city's main sporting initiatives, bringing residents together around organized games and public events. Amid mines, saloons, and constant tension, the club helped create a sense of community and order. Baseball showed that Tombstone also sought stability and civic life beyond violence. Recorded between 1885 and 1888, the image shows the stagecoach that traveled between Tombstone and Bisbee, two cities closely tied to mining in Arizona. This type of transport was vital for carrying passengers, mail, gold, and supplies. Journeys could last hours or days depending on terrain, and drivers needed detailed knowledge of routes, water points, and dangerous areas. A cowboy rides ahead as a wagon advances through the arid landscape of western Texas. Signal Mountain, also called Signal Peak, served as a natural landmark near Big Spring around 1900, guiding travelers, cattle ranchers, and wagon trains along long and poorly marked routes. Known as Alice Squirrel Tooth, she gained notoriety in the saloons of Dodge City and other frontier towns in the 1870s. She worked as a dancer in environments frequented by cowboys, gamblers, and gunmen, where music and alcohol dominated the nights. Over time, she left the stage and began managing a brothel in Sweetwater, Texas, becoming a madam. On December 10, 1869, Wyoming became the first United States territory to grant women full voting rights, decades before national approval. The measure was strategic and symbolic, intended to attract settlers and assert political modernity. Years later, leaders such as Alice Paul would take the struggle to the national stage, turning women's suffrage into a nationwide movement. The Tandre Saloon stood out for its decoration filled with hunting trophies, a symbol of status and skill in interior Texas. Establishments like this also served locally produced alcohol, often without sanitary control, and operated under their own rules. Alcohol consumption was intense before prohibition laws. Among giant logs and near total isolation, this family built their life near Salem, Oregon. Living there meant facing cold, wild animals and heavy daily labor without guarantees of success. Pine timber supported homes, fences, and local commerce, but also sealed the landscape's fate. Decades later, the forest would be cut down and replaced by agricultural fields. Because of its small size, the 1849 Colt pocket became a common choice as a concealed weapon. Light, compact, and easy to carry, it fit into a man's coat pocket or could be hidden under layers of clothing. Women also resorted to it, keeping the revolver discreetly concealed within the folds of a dress, made possible by the smaller caliber and slim profile. The Imperial and Empire mines drove the growth of Gold Hill, Nevada, turning the village into an active center of the silver rush in the 1860s. The pioneer steam laundry served miners and families, using boilers and wagons to collect and return clothes, something rare on the frontier. Two saloon girls pose inside a Montana brothel. Many of these women were young and came from the eastern United States or Europe, attracted by promises of work. In Western brothels, services included companionship, dancing, conversation, and drinks. Prices varied by town and reputation, ranging from a few dollars per visit to much higher sums in more refined establishments.